pleasure to introduce to you Dan Carlton, who is the pastor. That's the only title he uses. I would typically introduce him as the senior pastor, but pastor is his title at Culpeper Baptist Church. Joel and I were educated at a Baptist college, and we have a great love for significant parts of the Baptist tradition. But you can imagine moving into town and being the new girl priest on the block that I held my breath a little bit the first time I met the pastor of the largest, very established, incredibly successful, embedded in the community Baptist church. And one of God's graceful gifts to me was to find a colleague who deeply cared about this community and lived what I had come to understand the greatest gifts of the Baptist tradition to be, and welcomed me. Since then, we have had the benefit of being together as we did a 5th grade stations program for the Culpeper Minutemen 250th anniversary in 2025 when all the 5th graders in the county came through. And we got to do a little bit of a stand-up gig, and I got to be the establishment, and he got to be the disestablishment, which I am very clear that 250 years ago, I probably would not have been Anglican. And there are enough evidence of, that uneasy leadership, and enough evidence of the vestrymen in this congregation who went to fight for the revolution that I think there was quite a lot of disease in a lot of Anglicans with the system. And yet, we still represented the establishment, and we still do. So, I'm really excited to introduce you to Dan Carlton to hear a lot more about those Baptist dissenters and the gift they gave the world by insisting on freedom of religion.
Thank you. I'm grateful for Stacy and the work they do here at Little Fork. I pastor a 252-year-old church. I have a great heart for historic churches. We need a revitalization of historic churches in our country to remind us of these great stories that we're talking about today. So I appreciate you all taking the time to do it, and just an incredible honor for me to be on a panel with Hillary, Dr. Irwin, and Dr. Markham. They're significant and above my state, so I'm glad to be here as a dissenter, and I do have shoes on my feet if you needed to know that. Let me talk a little bit about the era that Baptists go from persecuted to growth. We've talked about already the Great Awakening that happens in Virginia from 1740 to 1790. Started really with the Presbyterians, an overwhelming response to the gospel that they were experiencing with the sermons of George Whitefield making their ways around Virginia. The problem with that is Presbyterians were still pretty educated. They were not the common man. And when you're trying to get to the common man, you need some Baptists and some uneducated Baptists who are willing to stand on wine barrels or wherever else and preach. And so Baptists kind of picked up where the Presbyterian part of the Great Awakening had kind of died down a little bit. And this incredible emphasis on your salvation, your personal response to the gospel. Nobody between you and God. You alone, this individualistic fervor, this decision to be baptized, this preaching by the common man. That's all that Baptists are doing in that time period. And there is just an incredible response to the gospel message during that time period. So Baptists are growing. They're getting stronger. Their willingness to preach to free and enslaved blacks is noticed. Not to say that Baptists had a great view of African Americans and their experience, but they did think it was important to preach to them. They were greatly persecuted. They would run through their meetings on horseback and whip the preacher. The people that were there, if they would not testify against the preacher, they would take them to court. They would abuse them. One, John Pickett, who was preaching in Culpeper, I'll just read a quote from him. James Ireland, it's a quote about John Pickett's preaching. "Enemies and opposers of religion let loose on an abundance of Negroes, seizing and whipping them." And I think it's important that we realize this is real persecution. This isn't, celebrity go to jail for 24 hours and they'll let you out. They are dealing with great persecution. These are the 11 Baptist preachers that are imprisoned in Culpeper. They are Nathaniel Saunders, who's the first pastor of the church I serve. I've been to his grave over in Orange County. The arrest warrant for Nathaniel Saunders is at the Virginia Baptist Historical Society at the University of Richmond. James Ireland, who we've already heard this morning, I'll speak a little bit more about him. The bell in our steeple today is the memorial bell for James Ireland. Elijah Craig, now when I speak to Baptists, I have to explain who Elijah Craig is. I might not have to do that with Lutherans. You might know Elijah Craig because after he left Virginia, he went to Kentucky and invented something called American bourbon that you can buy today at your local ABC store. Thomas Ammon, Adam Banks, John Corbley, John Delaney, William McClanahan, I'll come back to him, Thomas Maxwell, Anderson Moffett, who had a great nephew who had a pretty fascinating story in Danville, Virginia, and then John Pickett. Nearly half of Virginia Baptist pastors were imprisoned at some point during this era. It's ugly and it's harsh. And we know the most about James Ireland because he wrote his story. And so we've already heard this reference. James Ireland talked about the prison in Culpeper as his palace in Culpeper. And he would preach through the cell, right? These Baptists just wouldn't shut up. They just kept preaching. And so the cell is below street level, and I'll share where it was in just a moment. And so they would try to blow up, put gunpowder in the jail. They try to kill him. They would urinate through the door, through the window of the cell. This was awful time. James Ireland's quote there, "I count it the cost, freedom or confinement, liberty or prison. Having ventured all upon Christ, I determined to suffer for him." And then one of my favorite quotes when I tell this story is David Thomas, who was the co-founder of our church with Nathaniel Saunders, and he described Culpeper of one of the strongest of Satan's strongholds. And I've been advocating since we put that water tower out there at 15 and 29 that instead of welcome to Culpeper, we should say one of the strongest of Satan's strongholds. I think that would really get some attention out there. I do think it's important in this seemingly endless conversation that America was founded as a Christian country. I'm not so sure our Baptists would have agreed with that. They were persecuted greatly. I think we need to keep some perspective. That's why history matters. That's the site of the jail. If you are familiar with Culpeper, the building on the right, if I'm looking at it from the way I'm looking at it, is still there minus the steeple. We came in 1836, 7, 8, and we built a church on the site of the jail. I would have loved to have been a part of our church when we made that decision. So the original building is on the left. It burned in 1898, and then it was replaced by that building. We don't own that building anymore. Again, one of the things I advocate for in Culpeper is that story needs to be told on Davis Street much more than it is. That's the lock and key from the Culpeper jail. That too is in the Virginia Baptist Historical Society at University of Richmond. I would tell you that is the most valuable Baptist artifact in North America. There is a story that J.L.M. Curry, who the Curry School of Education at UVA is named for, was speaking to Baptists in the 1840s. He had that lock and key in his hand, and while he spoke to those Virginia Baptists for over an hour, he kept turning the lock and key, and the minutes of that meeting say, and people just wept because they knew the price that had been paid for religious liberty. They are experiencing significant growth, and I'm going to come back to that a little bit later in the next section. So 1740s, 1790s, Great Awakening, Baptists are coming alive, and we are growing like crazy, but they're throwing us in jail in the late 1760s and the 1770s. And then we're just going to have this remarkable shift in the 1780s, 1770s, 1780s, and 1790s as Baptists continue to grow. So I'm going to stop right there because I want to talk more in the second wave of this about our contribution to religious freedom, which I think is the most distinctive thing we have as Baptists. But and I'm trying to also keep us on time. So what questions do you have for the dissenting Baptist? I can, yeah, or I can repeat the question too.
It won't end up on the recording. Thank you. It is, and just check.
Were they jailed, persecuted because of their doctrine?
No, because,
or because they were preaching to black people?
No, they were preaching without a license, so I should have distinguished that. The difference between Baptist and I think Lutherans, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Lutherans did seek permission in Virginia to worship, and they got a license. The Baptists said, we don't need no stinking license from human hands. We have a license from God to preach, and by golly, we're going to do it. And so they would be charged with disturbing the peace and put in jail.
I'm interested in the African slaves and whether they became preachers themselves,
Yeah.
or were they encouraged to be preachers?
Yeah, and this is the hard thing of history. So John Leland, who I'll talk about in a little bit, John Leland believes that slavery is awful, but he's not an abolitionist, right? He can't get there. So I guess you could say we elevated a view of enslaved people, but yeah, they are, in our church context, the largest group of people that attended what was Mount Pony and now Culpeper Baptist prior to the Civil War would have been enslaved people. That would have been overwhelmingly the largest number of people attending our church. They would have had no role. We would have identified one of them to kind of be a leader of that group, but always under the power of the church.
I grew up in an independent Baptist church that had no affiliation.
Yes.
Where did that tradition come from? Was
I
that a
think-
rebellion against like government dictated religion?
Yeah, I think that's always been there for Baptists. We have denominations, but if you pay attention to the Baptist world, and I can't speak to Lutherans and Episcopalians and all of that, we like to split more than we like to do anything together. So I just think it's always that thing. I would also tell you, if you look at the Baptist landscape in the United States, in Virginia, we do not have what we would call mega-church Baptist churches, right? And the reason we don't is because I think of the founding story of Virginia. We don't want this guy having too much power and control. We are individualistic. And so you can go to Texas and find big old Texas Baptist churches. You can't find those in Virginia. Our largest churches top out 800-900, and I think it's that current underneath the founding of who we are in the colonial era. That's just my opinion. All right, I want credit for getting us back on schedule.